It started with thousands of bubbles cascading over my pool edge like a foamy tidal wave. I thought I was hallucinating until I saw the security footage, Karen, the self-appointed HOA dictator, dumping industrial-strength detergent into my pristine waters. This wasn't her first offense, but this time she'd crossed a line. And I was about to teach her what happens when you mess with the wrong neighbor. My blood boiled as I watched her smirk, knowing she had calculated this attack perfectly. Years of her harassment flashed through my mind. The bogus fines, the constant surveillance, all because I refused to bow to her ridiculous rules. She had been after me for months, despite the fact that my house wasn't even part of the HOA. My crimes? Having the wrong shade of patio furniture, a mailbox that wasn't community standard, a lawn that was too natural, apparently having grass that wasn't chemically altered into a golf course with a capital offense. But this time she had crossed a line. My teeth nearly cracked from how hard I was clenching my jaw. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my murderous thoughts. It was not my best friend and an unfortunate witness to my morning meltdown. He took one look at the foamy disaster and nearly doubled over laughing. "Dude, did you install a hot tub overnight and forget to invite me?" he wheezed, hands on his knees. I glared at him before jabbing a finger at my phone screen. Karen. His laughter cut off like a switch. He grabbed the phone, squinting at the footage before letting out a low whistle. Oh, she's really outdone herself this time. Yeah, I'm about 5 seconds away from turning her yard into a swamp. Knott stroked his chin, pretending to consider the idea. A tempting thought, but let's go bigger. I frowned. Bigger? A slow grin spread across his face. HOA meetings today, right? I exhaled sharply, my mind already jumping ahead. Karen would be there, basking in her self-imposed authority, dictating her latest demands to the miserable homeowners forced to endure her reign. Maybe she thought she could get away with this because she assumed I wouldn't retaliate. That was her first mistake. By the time we arrived at the community center, the room was already packed. Rows of folding chairs were filled with neighbors, some looking as worn down as prisoners in a never-ending trial, others wearing the forced politeness of people who knew better than to cross Karen. At the front of the room, she stood like a queen addressing her court, her perfectly colored blonde bob unmoving despite the ceiling fan whirring overhead. And as I was saying, Karen's voice rang out, "We must enforce stricter visual standards for our community. There have been violations." Her eyes flicked to me with the subtlety of a car alarm. Some people believe they are above the rules. I raised my hand. "I have a question, Karen." She sighed as if already exhausted by my existence. "Yes, Jake." I stood, holding up my phone. "Would you say that dumping industrial-strength detergent into someone's personal property qualifies as a violation?" A murmur rippled through the crowd. Karen's smile didn't falter, but I saw the way her fingers twitched slightly, gripping the clipboard in front of her. "I don't know what you're implying, but if you're referring to that." She waved a dismissive hand. "Incident with your pool, I was merely helping to maintain neighborhood cleanliness. You should thank me, really." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to keep my voice level. "I have security footage of you doing it." The murmuring turned into a low chuckle from some of the less HOA loyal members of the audience. Karen's expression didn't waver, but I saw it, the tiniest flicker of something behind her eyes. Panic, maybe. "Security footage can be fleeting," she said smoothly. "And let's not forget, your pool has been a topic of concern for months. Perhaps this is a sign you should consider redesigning it to better fit community standards." Knott, sitting beside me, muttered under his breath, "Oh, she's good. Evil, but good." I exhaled through my nose. "So just to clarify, you think dumping soap into my private pool was justified because you don't like how it looks?" Karen's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think we should focus on the bigger picture here." I turned to the crowd. "Raise your hand if you think Karen is completely full of." "All right, that's enough." Karen cut in sharply. "If you have an issue, you're welcome to file a complaint through proper channels." Knott snorted. "Like you actually process complaints that aren't your own." A few quiet laughs slipped out from the back of the room. Karen straightened, regaining her poise. If there's nothing else, I'd like to move on to the next agenda item. I gritted my teeth. She was getting away with it again. But then, as I sat back down, Matt leaned over, eyes glinting with mischief. You know, he murmured, if you drain that pool, all that soap's got to go somewhere. I blinked at him, processing the suggestion. Then slowly, a grin spread across my face. Karen wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could too. That night, I stood in the darkness, watching as a hose snaked from my pool toward Karen's perfectly manicured lawn. Matt crouched beside me, his grin wide and filled with anticipation. My pool, which had been turned into a bubble factory thanks to Karen's detergent stunt, needed to be emptied anyway. Draining it onto my own lawn wasn't an option unless I wanted my yard to turn into a swamp. So logically, the next best place was the person responsible for the mess in the first place. The plan was simple. My hose was perfectly positioned to release a steady flow of water, not enough to cause immediate alarm, but enough to soak deep into the roots of her precious flower beds. The same beds she had spent years bragging about, the ones that had won her the neighborhood's Best Lawn award 5 years in a row. Not nudged me. It's really working. You think she'll notice right away? I smirked. She'll notice when the sun comes up and she steps outside expecting perfection, but finds a soap-covered disaster instead. We sat back, letting the plan unfold naturally. The night air was crisp, the quiet hum of the draining water almost meditative. I half expected something to go wrong, for Karen to somehow sense the disturbance in her domain and come storming out of her house like a suburban Sith Lord, but nothing happened. The street remained silent, the houses dark. It was almost teary-y. The next morning, I woke up to chaos. It started with shouting loud, screeching, Karen level shouting that rattled the entire book. I groggily pulled myself out of bed, rubbing my eyes as I made my way to the window. And there she was, standing in the middle of her lawn, arms flailing, her pristine landscape looking less like a professionally maintained paradise and more like an overflowing bubble bath. The foam had spread far beyond what I anticipated. It wasn't just soaking her grass, it had spilled onto the sidewalk, creeping toward the neighboring houses. Some kids from down the street had already discovered the mess and were gleefully jumping into the thick patches of foam, treating it like a winter wonderland. Matt arrived at my house seconds later, nearly breathless from laughing. Dude, have you seen it? It's worse than we thought. I followed him outside, and that's when I truly took in the extent of the disaster. The detergent hadn't just soaked into Karen's lawn, it had traveled downhill, pooling into the yards of at least 4 other houses. White suds clung to fences, flower beds, and porches, turning the entire street into a scene straight out of a slapstick comedy. The neighborhood had essentially been turned into a giant bubble party, and Karen was losing her mind in the center of it. I barely had time to process before she spotted me, her eyes locking onto mine like heat-seeking missiles. Her face was an unnatural shade of red as she stormed across the soapy street, slipping slightly but catching herself before she could completely eat pavement. You, she shrieked, stabbing a finger in my direction. This is your doing. I put on my best look of confusion, though I could feel Matt vibrating beside me, barely holding back laughter. My doing, Karen? I woke up just like everyone else. What exactly are you accusing me of? She flailed her arms wildly, pointing at the devastation. You drained your disgusting mess onto my property. Do you know how much damage this could cause? My lawn, my flowers, my irrigation system. A deep, satisfied part of me wanted to remind her that she was the one who dumped soap into my pool in the first place. Instead, I simply raised an eyebrow. Seems like karma to me. That was the wrong thing to say. Her face somehow turned an even deeper shade of crimson. You are going to pay for this. I am calling the HOA, the city, and the police. This is destruction of property. I sighed. Karen, I just drained my pool. If that soapy water somehow ended up on your lawn, well, that sounds like an unfortunate coincidence. She let out a frustrated shriek before storming off toward her house, already dialing numbers on her phone. By the time the city inspector arrived, the scene had only gotten worse. The film had spread further, some of it even drifting onto the main road. The kids were still playing in it, their parents too amused to stop them. A few neighbors were even taking pictures, likely to add to their collection of reasons why Karen shouldn't be in charge. The inspector was a middle-aged man who looked like he had seen enough suburban nonsense for a lifetime. He listened to Karen's frantic explanation, his expression remaining flat and unimpressed as she dramatically pointed at the soap-covered ruins of her front yard. When he finally turned to me, he let out a tired sigh. "Sir, did you drain your pool under a lawn?" I kept my face neutral. "I drained my pool, yes. But where the water went after that?" "Well, I can't control gravity." Matt snorted so hard I thought he might choke. The inspector pinched the bridge of his nose before pulling out his notepad. "Technically, there's no ordinance against draining pool water, but considering that." He gestured vaguely at the foamy chaos, extent of the damage. "I need to investigate further." Karen crossed her arms, looking victorious. "Finally, arrest him." The inspector gave her a long, unamused look. "Ma'am, this isn't a criminal matter. At worst, it's a civil dispute." Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish, completely thrown off by the lack of immediate legal consequences. Meanwhile, Nat leaned over and whispered, "I love how she thought you were going to be taken away in cuffs over some soap." I fought back a grin. "Yeah, real high-stakes crime." The inspector took a few more notes before stepping back. "I'll have to file a report, but unless there's actual property damage beyond some lawn issues, this isn't something that warrants further action." Carrie made a strangled sound, her frustration reaching new heights. "This is an attack. A coordinated attack on my property." As the inspector started to respond, I noticed Matt staring intently at his phone, frowning slightly. He'd gone unusually quiet, scrolling through something with increasing interest. Suddenly, his eyes widened, and he nudged me discreetly. "Dude," he whispered, "I think I just found something you're going to want to see." Before I could ask what he meant, Karen escalated her tirade, demanding the inspector take immediate action. Her voice had reached that particular pitch that made neighborhood dogs howl in sympathy. Nat was still engrossed in his phone, a slow smile spreading across his face. As Karen continued her rant about property values and community standards, he finally looked up with an expression I'd never seen before, part shock, part mischievous delight. He leaned in close, keeping his voice low. "You're not going to believe what I just found." He showed me a screen, and I felt my eyebrows shoot up in surprise. While Karen had been threatening legal action against me, Nat had been digging through public records on his phone. And what he found was nothing short of extraordinary, a goldmine of information about Karen's own property violations. Unable to contain his excitement any longer, Nat suddenly laughed out loud, interrupting Karen mid-sentence. "Oh man, this just keeps getting better. Jake, you're going to love this." He turned his phone around, showing not just me, but the inspector as well. "Guess what? Karen's been breaking the law this whole time." The sudden shift in attention silenced Karen immediately. Whatever had been left of her smugness vanished, her lips parting slightly as she tried to process what was happening. I stepped forward, taking the phone from Matt's hand, my eyes scanning the screen. And there it was, the kind of revelation that could make even the most power-hungry jelly queen crumble. Nat had dug up property records, water usage reports, and even neighborhood complaints that never made it past Karen's iron grip. It turned out that for years, she had been illegally diverting city water into her long irrigation system, bypassing regulations and racking up a bill that she had never actually paid. The records were clear. She had installed an unauthorized underground connection, drawing thousands of extra gallons without approval. It wasn't just a violation of HOA guidelines, it was an outright offense. I looked up from the phone, my expression slowly morphing into the satisfaction I felt bubbling up inside me. "Karen," I said, dragging out her name just enough to watch her squirm, "you wouldn't happen to know anything about illegal water siphoning, would you?" Her hands clenched at her sides. "That's ridiculous." The city inspector, who had been trying to remain neutral in this whole mess, suddenly straightened. "What did you just say?" Nat, unable to hold back his excitement, turned his phone around for the inspector to see. She's been stealing water for years. That fancy gray mom? Yeah, it wasn't because of her so-called award-winning gardening skills. She's been running her own little water network. Karen's face turned ashen. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. That's a complete lie. You can't trust some internet conspiracy Matt found on his phone. The inspector took the phone, his brow furrowing as he scrolled through the documents. His silence stretched, and then he exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple like a man who had just realized his simple HOA dispute had turned into a government-level scandal. These are public records, he muttered. City complaints, violation reports, meter readings that don't match usage records. He turned back to Karen, and this time, the polite neutrality was gone. Ma'am, this is serious. Karen's panic was setting in now. This is harassment. They're making things up. You need to arrest them, not me. The inspector ignored her and pulled out his radio. I need someone from the water department out here ASAP. We might have a case of illegal siphoning. Karen sputtered, her carefully crafted composure shattering into pieces. The Meavers who had previously been watching the soap-covered fiasco unfold with mild amusement were now whispering amongst themselves, realizing that the woman who had terrorized them with fines and complaints had been breaking the biggest rule of all. One of the older residents, Mr. Thompson, chuckled under his breath. Looks like the HOA queen isn't as squeaky clean as she wants us to be. Karen turned on him, her face contorting in rage. You all are ungrateful. I built this neighborhood. I made it beautiful. By stealing from it? I asked, tilting my head. She ran out a frustrated shriek before pointing at me again. This is your fault. You and your disgusting pool. If you had just followed the rules, none of this would have happened. Matt laughed so hard he had to clutch his stomach. Oh, this is gold. She actually thinks she's the victim here. The next hour was a blur of escalating events. The city inspector called in reinforcements, and within minutes, workers from the water department arrived with equipment to check the irrigation system. They found the illegal connection almost immediately. Pipes hidden beneath Karen's flower beds were routed straight from a main city line. It wasn't just a minor infraction, it was theft. A costly, recordable, and prosecutable theft. Karen's excuses spiraled from outrage to desperation. She tried to claim ignorance, saying she had no idea how the system had been installed. Then she accused her late husband of doing it without telling her. Then, when that failed, she blamed the previous homeowner, despite the fact that she had lived there for over 20 years. The more she talked, the deeper she dug her own grave. The final nail in the coffin came when the water department official looked up from his report and shook his head. Ma'am, you've been flagged for unauthorized water use for nearly a decade. That's tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid city fees, not to mention potential fines. This is going to require legal action. Karen paled. Action? Most likely a hefty fine, the official continued. Possibly even charges if the city pursues them. The collective gasp from the neighborhood was almost comical. Karen, the woman who had made everyone's lives miserable, was about to face actual consequences. Real ones that she couldn't just bully her way out of with fake HOA rules. Her mouth opened and closed again, but she had nothing left to say. She was cornered and knew it. As the city officials started documenting everything, the HOA members who had once been her loyal enforcers began to shift away from her, whispering amongst themselves. It didn't take long before someone muttered, "We should hold a vote to remove her." Matt's eyes lit up. Oh, now that's a plot twist I can get behind. Karen tried one last desperate attempt at control. You can't remove me. I am the HOA. A younger woman who had been sitting quietly for most of the ordeal crossed her arms. Not anymore, you're not. Karen spun to the crowd, searching for any last shred of support, but all she found were blank stares and murmurs of agreement. She had lost. I watched it all unfold, arms crossed, letting the moment truly sink in. The woman who had spent years making my life miserable had just watched her entire empire collapse around her in a matter of hours. And all because she wanted to pour silk in my pool. Poetic justice at its finest. By the end of the day, Karen had been officially stripped of her HRE position, fined an ungodly amount of money, and was left standing in the middle of her ruined lawn as the sun began to set. The suds had finally started to dissipate, but the damage was done. Her once pristine lawn that had been her pride and joy was now a patchy, soap-stained mess. And I sat back on my porch, beers in hand, watching the last of the city officials drive away. Well, Not said, taking a long sip, that was an eventful day. I chuckled, stretching out my legs. Yeah, think she learned her lesson. Not snorted. Doubt it, but at least she won't be bossing anyone around anymore. I exhaled, feeling a strange sense of peace wash over me. For the first time in a long while, the neighborhood felt lighter. The reign of Karen was over. Then, as if the universe wanted to give me one final gift, I spotted something across the street, Karen, standing in the middle of her destroyed lawn, arms crossed, glaring at the sudsy remains of her once perfect world. I raised my beer in a silent toast. To Carmel, Not clinked his bottle against mine, and to the best pool revenge in history.